I set out early that day to ride my bike. The familiar hum of the tires against the asphalt and the warmth of the air were wrapping around me. It was a routine I often enjoyed, but this time I had a destination in mind. Rumors of a hidden government outpost, whispered among locals, had sparked my curiosity. They said it was an abandoned relic from another era, a place people avoided like the plague. I'd heard it all before, and I figured it was just another urban legend to keep the curious at bay. But as I turned off the main road, following a path that didn't appear on any map, the landscape transformed. The road became rough, the dust swirling around me, clinging to my skin. After a couple of miles, I spotted a series of low structures that seemed to melt into the ground, barely discernible against the rocky terrain. The outpost looked almost untouched, as if the world had forgotten it. Doors hung ajar, and a few solar panels still caught the sun, their purpose long since forgotten. It was strange to see something so foreign in the middle of nowhere. I parked my bike at the edge of the outpost and stepped inside. Each room felt like stepping into a time capsule, with dusty equipment and peeling posters bearing slogans from decades past. It was almost like the place was waiting for someone to return. I found myself drawn to an old control room, the heart of this forgotten place. I ran my fingers over the dusty surfaces, half expecting to find someone had just stepped out for a moment. But the stillness was absolute, and the remnants of the past loomed large, making me question why I was really there. What had happened to those who once inhabited this space? That's when I heard it, a sudden mechanical click that cut through the silence. What had I just activated? The moment the alarms blared, piercing sounds sliced through the hush. I stumbled back, instinctively moving toward the exit. But when I reached my bike, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded. I kicked at the bike in frustration. This couldn't be happening. The alarms continued their relentless wail, amplifying my growing sense of isolation in this desolate place. I was completely alone, or at least I thought I was. Desperation set in as I dashed around the outpost, searching for some way to silence the chaos. I pressed buttons at random, hoping for a miracle, but nothing worked. I was stuck, and too far from any town to make it back on foot. As the hours dragged on, I thought of what might have happened to the previous occupants of this place. Had they faced the same fate? Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the alarms cut off, plunging me into a silence that was somehow more unsettling than the noise had been. I stood there, breathing heavily, the quiet pressing down around me. I felt a sense of being let go, as if whatever force had trapped me had decided I could leave. I turned back to my bike, relief flooding through me until I noticed something on the seat. A piece of paper. My heart dropped. I had been so focused on the alarms and my escape that I hadn't seen anyone approach. Trembling, I picked up the note. The handwriting was uneven, hastily scrawled. "Stay away. Don't come back." I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows, but the outpost was silent once more. I glanced at my bike, and on an impulse, I kicked it. To my shock, the engine roared to life. As I rode away, the memory of that place haunted me. Yes, I had escaped, but the feeling of being watched persisted. A quiet whisper that I would never know who or what had truly controlled that place.
I decided to take a solo hike in a remote national park, hoping the solitude would help me heal from the emotional turmoil I had been carrying. In the last few months, I have been feeling suffocated by my life, burdened by the expectations of my job and my responsibilities. I filled up my backpack with essentials, water, snacks, power bank, a first aid kit, and headed down the winding trail, eager for the tranquility of the mountains. The route was familiar enough at first, winding through a canopy of leaves that filtered the sunlight into a comforting green glow. It felt almost like a scene from a movie, serene, picturesque. But as I ventured deeper into the wilderness, the surroundings began to change. It was easy to push the discomfort aside. After all, I was here to escape. Eventually I stumbled upon an old, abandoned water reservoir, its outline barely visible through the dense vegetation. I felt drawn to the crumbling structure, where the remnants of machinery lay like forgotten relics of the past. I stepped inside, inhaling the musty scent of damp earth. The interior was a labyrinth, illuminated only by the occasional shaft of light filtering through gaps in the walls. It felt both awe-inspiring and upsetting, as if the very walls kept secrets long forgotten. I pressed on, intrigued by the history hidden within this decaying shell. Then, without warning, I stepped onto a slick patch of floor that gave way beneath me. Hysteria took over as I lost my footing, and a part of the ceiling collapsed, crashing down around me. I was trapped, my leg pinned beneath a beam. In an instant, the outside felt so far away, as if I had crossed an invisible line between two worlds. As I lay there, the enormity of my situation settled in. I fought against the rubble, struggling to find a way out. My thoughts spiraled into a dark vortex, amplifying my fears and doubts. Each attempt to shift the debris felt futile, suffocating me with their silence. The memories of why I had come to this place started to churn in my mind. Time lost all meaning at that moment. I had come seeking peace, yet found myself on the brink of madness, trapped in a place that had become a prison of my own making. I shifted my body, trying to reach my backpack, which felt impossible. My phone was in there, and the thought of calling for help kept me focused. But every time I moved, the weight of the rock pressed down harder, and I couldn't quite twist my arm in the right way. Finally, I managed to stretch enough to grab the bottle of water tucked in a side pocket. It wasn't the help I wanted, but at least it was something. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself amidst the chaos in my mind. I had to escape this trap. The thought of freedom kept me fighting against the rubble. I focused all my energy. The struggle was excruciating, but I pushed against the heavy beam. My bruised leg throbbed with pain, and I could feel warm blood trickling down my ankle. But I had to continue. I had to break free from this nightmare, to feel the wind on my face once more. When I finally managed to free my leg, I stumbled, everything tilting as I adjusted to standing again. I could now see an exposed fracture on my leg, definitely a sign that it was broken. And though I rummaged through the first aid kit, nothing seemed to help. But I had escaped. What mattered at that time was that I could get out of the place that had threatened to consume me completely. Navigating back through the darkened corridors, I stumbled into the sunlight, overwhelmed with pain and disbelief. I didn't even register that the sun was almost setting. To me, it felt unnaturally bright and sharp, and I was struck by how alive the world felt. I stood there for a moment, dazed by the wind. When I finally grabbed my phone, I noticed that several hours had passed. I could tell another whole story about the struggle of more than 3 hours to reach civilization, stumbling with a broken leg. But that deserves more than a passing mention, so I'll leave it for another time.
We were very excited for our honeymoon at an exclusive and secluded Airbnb. Nestled deep in the woods, it promised the perfect escape, a chance to celebrate our love away from the chaos of daily life. The cabin, with its rustic charm, stood proudly among trees that swayed gently in the wind. I thought the isolation would provide us the privacy we craved, a romantic backdrop for unforgettable memories. That first night, we settled into our welcoming ambience, warmed only by the fireplace and soft candlelight. Everything felt idyllic, like the start of a fairy tale. We lost ourselves in each other, finally having the intimacy we'd wanted since the wedding day. But when I drifted into sleep, I found myself submerged in a dream that unveiled a deep-seated anxiety I hadn't acknowledged in years. In my dream, I stood at the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. Below me lay an endless abyss, and there was my partner, reaching out in desperation. But the pull of the void was stronger. It tugged at my soul, filling me with a suffocating dread of losing everything I held dear. I awoke gasping. My partner stirred beside me. A frown etched on his face, as if he too had been dragged into the depths of my nightmare. During the day, I tried to surpass the fear, but when sleep claimed me again the following night, the dreams turned darker and unspeakable. I brought up the nightmares, and my husband tried to console me with affection and good humor. I hoped they would finally end after talking about it. But by the third night, the nightmares continued. I found myself trapped in a maze of dark hallways, each turn revealing my deepest insecurities. I could hear my partner's laughter echoing, but it morphed into something mocking and cruel. No matter how fast I ran, I could never reach him. He remained just out of grasp. I woke up screaming, my voice swallowed by the quiet of the cabin. My husband jolted awake, concern etched deep into his face. I could see the worry as he realized how much these nightmares were starting to take hold, casting a shadow over our celebration trip. No matter how hard we tried to have a great day, each night brought new nightmares, more twisted than the last. One afternoon, feeling particularly exhausted, I ventured outside alone. The further I went, the more it felt like I was hallucinating. As I returned, I saw my husband inside the cabin. The look on his face was as if he had seen something horrible. He was pale and sweating cold. The connection between us felt so fragile that we only exchanged silent glances. I knew this shouldn't be happening between us. I reached out and hugged him. We were trying to reset our honeymoon, to find solace despite the tension. As we climbed into bed and let ourselves forget our surroundings, my gaze was drawn to something horrifying on the ceiling. Blood. It began to cascade down like a waterfall. I screamed in panic, and it definitely killed the vibe. The blood disappeared instantly, and even though I knew it was another hallucination, I had to get out of there. We couldn't pack faster, leaving much earlier than planned. We stumbled out of the cabin, adrenaline coursing through us as we left behind what had just happened. The forest, which once felt inviting, now loomed ominously, its shadows stretching like the remnants of our frayed sanity. As we tossed our bags into the car, I could sense the raw pressure between us. The engine roared to life, but the feeling of slipping further into madness gnawed at the edges of my mind. We were both drained, not just from my nightmarish visions, but from the unnerving realization that we were barely holding ourselves together. As the landscape blurred by, we were still lost in our own heads, unsure of what awaited us next. The highway felt disorienting, and I wondered if the terror was truly behind us, or if we were still waiting for the worst to happen.
The excitement in the air buzzed like static as we stood at the cave's entrance, our flashlights illuminating the rugged rock faces. The group of us, students hungry for adventure, had heard tales of this uncharted cave system, filled with legends of miners lost to time. We have been warned by locals, but the thrill of discovery propelled us forward. We convinced ourselves we were here for nothing but a tale to tell. As we entered, the temperature dropped, swallowing our laughter. The beams of our flashlights danced across the walls, revealing intricate paintings depicting scenes of struggle. They were drawn in vivid colors, their stories frozen in time. The further we ventured, the more the cave began to change. The narrow passageways expanded into wide chambers, only to constrict again, creating a maze that twisted in unpredictable ways. Each step I took felt like a question. What lay ahead, and at what cost? It wasn't long before I noticed the first apparition, a fleeting shade at the edge of my vision. I turned, and there was nothing there. But it could have been a trick of the light. The others laughed, trying to maintain the thrill, but their voices wavered as the cave suffocated us. As we moved deeper, we encountered more figures, their forms grotesque and distorted, faces contorted in anguish. The expressions of pain seemed to reach out, pulling us closer. Each sighting sent shockwaves through the group, fear beginning to fracture our fellowship. We no longer felt like explorers. We were intruders in a realm that demanded respect. I could see it in their eyes, the same mounting anxiety I felt. We were becoming aware of the obscurity surrounding us, how it thickened with each passing moment. Our earlier bravado faded. We began to retrace our steps, but the path seemed to shift beneath us. Walls that once guided us now lead us further into the depths. A suffocating claustrophobia clung to us. The walls felt alive, pulsing with our anxiety, as if the cave fed off it, growing stronger. The closeness pressed on us, until some couldn't bear it any longer. I noticed one of the students begin to hyperventilate, his breathing rapid and shallow. He tried to claw his way back, pushing others aside. Someone grabbed him, trying to calm him down, but his fear was contagious. Soon, more of us started losing composure. A few stumbled and even passed out. Voices turned from quiet whispers to angry shouts. Desperation had us snapping at one another, fighting over the smallest decisions, whether to turn left or right, who should go first. In the scramble, tensions flared until one of them swung at another, shouting that we were all going to die down there. Just when I caught sight of a glimmer at the end of a tunnel and rushed toward it, the light faded, and the cave seemed to have truly claimed us. After a long time had passed, surrounded by the ghosts of the miners, I understood the truth. The cave was not just a place. It was a trap designed to ensnare those who dared to seek its secrets. If we didn't confront our own ghosts, we risked becoming a part of its story, a fate no different from those who had come before us. We needed to find a way out, not just physically, but within ourselves, before it consumed us. As we steadied ourselves, I looked around at my companions. Together, we began to confront the apparitions, acknowledging their suffering and sharing our own burdens. But after hours inside an unhealthy, poorly ventilated, and moldy space, only 2 of us had the strength to continue. The others were left behind, collapsed against the walls or slumped over in exhaustion, their spirits broken. Those of us who remained found a sense of direction within the chaos. Finally, we pushed forward, navigating the changing paths with newfound determination. As we forged ahead, the apparitions faded, and we emerged from the cave, breathless and tormented. Once we reached the grid point, we managed to find help, desperate to explain what we'd endured and witnessed. Families of the missing students joined us as we joined the search parties, combing through the area for over a month and retracing our steps over and over. But despite their relentless efforts, the others were never found, vanished without a trace.
It happened in the summer. The day was beautiful as I stepped onto the deck of my new yacht. Everything was pristine, from the oversized sun loungers to the gourmet kitchen stocked with enough food and drink to last a week. It felt like paradise, my sanctuary, far from all my responsibilities. The family issues, the constant meetings, the unending emails and calls. I set out to enjoy the quiet, armed with a lot of entertainment and an overwhelming desire for peace. But as the sun dipped, an impending storm loomed over the horizon. I dismissed it at first. Storms were a normal part of being out at sea. I had the luxury of a yacht after all. I could ride it out in comfort. I sought shelter inside, poured myself a drink, and tried to shake the anxiety as the once comforting walls seemed tight. The storm hit fast and hard. Before, I was feeling prepared for unforeseen events, but I started to feel that if the worst happened, I had no one there to rely on. Then, amidst the chaos, I spotted a figure struggling in the water. My instincts kicked in, and despite the raging storm, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. The thought of letting someone drown while I sat comfortably on my yacht was unbearable. I grabbed the dinghy and fought against the wind and waves to reach him. The moment I pulled him aboard, the relief in his eyes was palpable. He introduced himself as a wealthy man who had been caught in the storm while sailing. As the rain poured down and the wind howled, his demeanor shifted. Initially grateful, he quickly grew agitated and fearful, triggering me even more. He explained that he might have lost his cruiser, and that was just one of the many challenges he was facing at the moment. I tried to ease the tension by offering him a drink and steering the conversation away from the tempest. As we fought to secure the yacht, he started pacing the deck, glancing nervously at the horizon, as if expecting some invisible threat to emerge from the depths. "You don't get it," he said, his tone sharp. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." At that moment, I felt terrible. I was the man trying to escape my life. And there was him, reflecting back the darker parts of myself that I had tried to bury. His fear morphed into anger, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. At some point I snapped, "Stop acting like I'm the problem," frustration boiling over. "I saved you. I don't owe you anything." His eyes darkened. "You don't understand. I know what it's like to be on the edge. You think this yacht is safe? You think you're safe?" Deep down, I knew we were both trapped, not just literally. As the tempest raged, so did our confrontation. Two drunk men, consumed by rage and fear. It was a very dangerous combination. We tumbled against the railing, the yacht rocking violently beneath us. I was nauseous as I tried to push him. My hands felt unsteady, slipping off his shirt as if it were slick with water. He swung wildly, his fist connecting with my jaw. I retaliated, throwing a punch that made him stumble back, disoriented. We could barely focus, and I felt my head spinning. The storm began to fade into the background, and everything around us dimmed, replaced by a shade that swallowed us whole. When I woke up, the storm had finally begun to subside. But I found myself alone on the deck. I was left grappling with a profound confusion. As I stared out at the horizon, the sense of unresolved conflict persisted. The yacht was eerily still. The only sound was the gentle lap of waves against the hull. I peered over the water, now calm. But there was no sign of the stranger at all. Had he fallen overboard? Was he lost in the depths? Was he even real? Or was he only a twisted projection of my own fears?
It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a break from our busy lives, a weekend for my family to reconnect with nature. We drove deep into the mountains, the road becoming increasingly narrow, the trees closing in around us. When we finally reached the campsite, I was struck by how peaceful it felt, almost isolated in its beauty. Towering pines surrounded us, their branches blocking out any trace of civilization. It was exactly the kind of off-grid adventure we had been craving, or at least that's what I thought. We spent the day hiking and soaking up the freedom from ringing phones and the constant noise of the city. But as night began to fall, the serenity of the setting took on a different feel. What initially felt like a comforting embrace began to weigh on us. My husband started a fire, and we huddled close, glancing toward the woods that now felt ominously alive. Then my daughter's satellite phone rang, unexpected like a siren. I flinched at the noise. Who could possibly be calling us out here? She answered the call, and I could see the color drain from her face. I leaned in closer, anxiety knotting my stomach as she listened in stunned silence. When she finally hung up, she told us about a man, a camper who had been lost for days, hiding from someone who was stalking him in the woods. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, some kind of crossed signal from a nearby town, but the certainty in her voice shook my resolve. As we settled in for the night, my mind raced, replaying the details of the call, twisting them into something far worse. What if it wasn't a prank? What if someone was out there really hunting? I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. It was just a night in the woods, after all. But as the hours passed, that initial calm started to unravel. Around midnight, we began to hear them. Footsteps. At first, they were barely audible, blending in with the natural sounds of the forest. But soon it became clear that these steps were deliberate, almost purposeful, circling our campsite like a predator stalking its prey. Each time the footsteps stopped, a silence took over. I strained to hear anything else, a whisper of wind, a distant animal. Just when I thought I'd imagined the sounds, they would start again, closer this time. Were we really being hunted? In a fleeting moment, I thought I saw someone lurking at the edge of the firelight. I turned to my family, their faces illuminated by the fire, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and terror. We were miles away from help, isolated in a way that was now terrifying. We huddled close together. Sleep eluded us, every shadow and sound outside feeling like a threat. When dawn finally broke, I stared at the ashes of the bonfire, trying to make sense of the bizarre events that had unraveled over that brief trip. As we loaded the car, I took one last look at the trees, half hoping the light of day would chase away the fears of the night. But instead, I saw large, deep footprints circling our campsite, unmistakably human. They were fresh, overlapping in a way that suggested someone had been watching us for hours, perhaps even pacing around our camp. The realization sent chills down my spine. We drove away in silence, and as we left the mountains behind, I still found myself glancing back, expecting to see someone watching us drive away. I'll never know what really happened out there. What might have happened to the lost camper, or if we truly escaped the evilness that wanted us to stay.
During my sabbatical year, I joined an ecotourism group that aimed to document wildlife conservation efforts in a remote wilderness area. As we set off, the beauty of the environment filled me with a sense of purpose. However, as we ventured deeper into the wilderness, there was a heaviness among the participants that made me uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. We moved along narrow trails, surrounded by towering trees and the occasional sound of rustling leaves. Strangely, we noticed traps had been laid along our path, and I found remnants of what appeared to be illegal hunting. The sight of an old trap, rusted but recently disturbed, filled me with unease. One afternoon while exploring, I stumbled upon a hidden spot that sent a cold shiver down my back. The ground was littered with carcasses of animals that had met a brutal end. Discarded hunting equipment lay strewn about, each item whispering stories of suffering and loss. I felt compelled to document and photograph this discovery. Returning to the group, I shared what I had found, hoping for a unified response, a collective resolve to report the illegal activity. But as I spoke, I noticed murmurs of disagreement rippled through the participants. It became clear that not everyone was there to advocate for the wildlife. Some were eager to take matters into their own hands. The idea of hunting the hunters was met with nods of approval from a few members, while others recoiled in shock. The tension intensified, and the truth about each person's character emerged, rough and unfiltered, revealing the complexities of human nature. Night fell, and as we gathered around the campfire, the conversations turned heated. Alliances were formed, trust crumbled between the group, and I began to question not just the poachers hiding in the woods, but the very people I had come to rely on for support. The true horror of this trip lay in the unraveling of our humanity. We were all hunters now, each driven by different motives, grappling with our own moral complexities. The next day, as we moved deeper into the woods, the laughter and chatter that once filled the air faded and was replaced by an upsetting silence. We stumbled upon a clearing littered with more traps, tangled metal, and discarded hunting gear that spoke of cruelty and disregard. Each one felt like a sign that we were stepping into a realm where the rules of civilization no longer applied. I looked around at my companions, some of whom appeared fascinated, while others wore expressions of disgust. Conversations began, and I overheard heated arguments about the justification of violence against those who desecrated the land. One member, a man I once considered an ally, advocated for extreme measures. His words were laced with fervor, igniting a dangerous excitement in the others. I watched as some nodded in agreement, eager for a hunt that would strip away their humanity. The horror of the situation unfolded like the very traps we had encountered, ensnaring us in a moral dilemma from which there might be no escape. I attempted to voice my concerns, to bring us back from the brink, but my words fell on deaf ears. Finally, we reached a makeshift campsite that the poachers had likely abandoned. In the dirt, I found evidence of their presence. Scraps of clothing, rests of food hastily consumed, and even a map detailing the traps laid in the area. As we stood among the ruins of their existence, I realized the full extent of our moral decline. I turned to warn my companions, but the glint in their eyes told me all I needed to know. In the wild, it wasn't just the hunters we needed to fear. It was the prowling darkness within us, ready to pounce and consume everything.
I signed up to help restore an old village that had been devastated by an illness. It sounded simple enough, a volunteer project to give new life to a place that had been empty for years. I figured it would be something I could add to my resume, get some fresh air, maybe learn some new skills. But when I arrived, the place immediately gave me chills. It wasn't haunted in an obvious way. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that starts to feel like its own kind of noise. The buildings were almost skeletal, stripped down. As I walked past the decaying houses, I noticed a doll with matted hair, faded family photos, and a set of dishes still stacked on a table covered in dust. It felt like everyone had just vanished, like they'd walked out and never returned. At first, I ignored the bad feeling. I told myself it was just an abandoned place. But as I worked each day, something started gnawing at me. The other volunteers joked about the odd atmosphere, saying stuff like, "Oh, it's just the ghosts of the village." But even they looked uneasy. After a few days, I started having weird dreams. In them, I was back in the village, but it was different, alive. I'd see faces I'd never seen before, people moving through the streets, laughing, talking. It was like I was watching a scene from the past. But every dream ended the same way. The people would start noticing me, their eyes hollow and haunted. I'd wake up feeling their sadness like it had seeped into my bones. One day, I stumbled upon an old well at the edge of the village. It was cracked, the stones chipped and worn down by years of weather. There was something about it that felt wrong. I walked toward it, feeling this strange pull, and leaned over the edge. It was way deeper than it looked from a distance. I couldn't see the bottom, just darkness stretching on. And that's when I heard it, the faintest sound coming up from the depths. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. I told myself I was just tired, forgot about it, and went to sleep. But that night, the dreams came back, clearer this time. I was inside one of the houses at a family dinner. They were laughing, clinking glasses, the whole scene warm and happy. Then, one by one, their faces shifted, turned pale, empty. They stared at me, like they were trying to tell me something. But no words came out. The other volunteers noticed my obsession with the village's mysteries and the illness. A few of them teased me about it. But it wasn't a joke. The worst part was, the sadness that I felt during the day crept into my nights, seeping into my dreams and waking moments. I'd go into a house and feel this wave of sorrow, like I was intruding on something deeply personal, like I was stepping into someone else's pain. I'd go to the well and felt a sense of grief I couldn't explain, like I was letting them down by not understanding. A week in, the lines between their memories and my reality blurred. I felt like the village wanted something from me, and I couldn't turn away. I wasn't sure if I'd come to restore this village or to be consumed by it anymore. One afternoon, while the other volunteers took a break, I started poking around, looking for anything that could explain what this place was about and why the air seemed soaked with memories. In one of the oldest houses, tucked away in a corner, I found a diary. The more I read, the more my stomach turned. It contained daily life notes and something darker. Whoever had kept it had started out chronicling normal things: weather, crops, community gatherings. But then the tone changed. There was an entry about how the illness spreaded. It started with a cough, then fatigue, and then something worse. People couldn't keep food down. They'd be racked with fevers. Whole families were affected, while others seemed untouched. The villagers had been terrified, desperate to find the cause. They'd suspected the water but couldn't prove it. And then it hit me. The well, a place I'd been drawn to over and over. The water was tainted. The villagers had been drinking it, not knowing it was slowly poisoning them, killing them off one by one. They knew something was wrong, but no one could figure out how to stop it. There were notes about attempts to dig a new well, but the illness spread too fast, taking down entire families before they even had a chance. The last few entries were almost illegible, scribbled so frantically that I could barely make out the words. But I didn't need to read them to understand. The fear was there. These people had died, terrified and isolated. For a while, I just sat there, feeling this mix of horror and guilt. The other volunteers asked me if I was okay when I finally came outside, but I just shrugged them off, said I was fine. How could I explain it to them? I couldn't look at the village the same way anymore. I felt a strange urge to tell someone, to share what I'd learned. So a few days later, I gathered some of the volunteers and told them about the diary. I even suggested that we collect evidence for study and clean the well, as if scrubbing it down would somehow make up for what had happened there. They went along with it, humoring me, but I could tell they thought I was taking this whole project a little too seriously. Even as we cleaned out the well, I could almost sense their presence. I wasn't sure if they wanted something or if they were just there, stuck in some kind of limbo. But their sadness was definitely present. The village was quieter that night, somehow emptier. The other volunteers went about their work, chatting and laughing, like we weren't standing on top of a tragedy. When we left the village, I took one last look back, telling myself it was just an old, forgotten place, and that everything I'd felt was simply empathy for all that had been lost. But as the days passed, I wouldn't let go of the realization of what happens when knowledge is absent, of how easily tragedy can take hold in hidden places of the world, leaving people vulnerable to forces they can't control or understand.
The wilderness had a way of swallowing everything. Sounds, lights, even my own thoughts. The first few days unfolded as I hoped. Just me and nature, the hum of the wind, the rustling leaves, and nothing else. I carried my satellite hotspot for emergencies. mostly to reassure myself that I could still check in or upload a photo if I wanted to. It felt good to know I wasn't completely isolated. The trail I was hiking was mapped out weeks ago, but the GPS started showing me I was off course. Every few minutes it drifted, placing me miles away from where I knew I was. At first, I shrugged it off as a weak signal. Those mountains can mess with technology. But when I returned to camp, my hotspot flashed erratically, despite being fully charged. I convinced myself it was a simple glitch, something I could fix in the morning without much trouble. That night, as I settled into my tent, my phone pinged, a notification from an unknown number. I tried to read a message, but it was written in an untranslatable language. I dismissed it as a prank or a random misfire, telling myself that out here signals can get mixed up. But the next day, my devices acted even stranger. My phone's camera activated out of nowhere, snapping pictures while I hiked, making me feel like an unwilling participant in someone else's game. I shut everything down, hoping to regain control over my trip. But when I returned to camp, I noticed something frightening. My pack had been moved. Just a bit, only someone who knew exactly how I had left it would notice. I rifled through my belongings, searching for anything missing, trying to understand how this could have happened. But nothing was gone. It felt like someone had simply inspected my gear. As night fell, my phone pinged again with another message from the same unknown number. I froze, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The pattern became painfully clear as the days wore on. My devices misbehaved more with each passing hour. My GPS would reset, showing unachievable routes, and my hotspot would flash unexpectedly. Each time I checked my phone, a new message awaited me. I could no longer convince myself it was all a coincidence. Someone out here was orchestrating some kind of unnerving game. The further I hiked, the more my paranoia grew. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I was hyper-aware, scanning for any signs of my unseen stalker, a broken branch, an upturned rock, anything that would suggest I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own hurried footsteps and the unrelenting notifications that continued to taunt me. Then, I caught a glimpse of him, a figure standing motionless in the shadows of the trees, watching me from a distance. He didn't pursue me. He didn't need to. The simple knowledge of his presence was enough to send me tumbling. I tripped down a ravine, fixated only on escaping this invisible predator. I just ran, driven only by the instinct to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was there. I eventually made it back to the main road, feeling as if I had just woken from a nightmare. By then, the messages stopped. Days have passed since that, and even though I tried everything, deleting every app, resetting my devices, and even changing my phone number, something has permanently changed. Every so often, my phone pings with those same creepy messages, in that same distinct language, now familiar.
The drive to the campsite took longer than I anticipated. I was used to the bustle of city life, the constant activity, and the jarring noise of traffic. Here, everything was different. The air was fresh, scented with cedar, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves. As I pulled into the clearing, where the trees parted to reveal a small cluster of tents, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. The campers gathered, a motley mix of personalities, each seeking their own escape. They all seemed friendly enough, sharing stories of previous outdoor adventures, laughter punctuating the calm ambiance. I smiled at their enthusiasm, feeling an invigorating rush at the thought of disconnecting from the unstoppable energy of modern life. We were given a brief orientation by the organizers, who presented the rules with a certain intensity, to stay within the designated areas and with the group, not to wander off, to respect the boundaries set for our safety. It sounded almost too strict, but I brushed off my unease as nerves. We gathered around the fire. The camaraderie felt genuine, as people swapped ghost stories and legends about the woods, tales designed to thrill and entertain. I felt a warm excitement, the kind that comes from being in the great outdoors, far away from the demands of daily life. As the night deepened and we went to sleep, I felt an oppressiveness settle over. The silence started to sneak in, and with it, a disquiet that I couldn't quite understand. I began to notice the sounds of nature, now kind of scary. The organizers had warned us about wildlife, but those distant rumbles didn't feel right. Sleep eluded me that first night. I lay in my tent, the fabric thin against the grass, each sound magnified in the quietude. I recalled the rules once more, the insistence on staying very close to the group. Why such precautions? The next day unfolded with an unusual vibe over our activities. We visited a nearby waterfall, its beauty almost enough to distract me from my apprehension. But even amidst the splendor, I felt an invisible barrier by the rules we were bound to follow. Each step further away from the campsite felt wrong, as if I were straying from a path I was never meant to take. The other campers exchanged furtive stares, their smiles now replaced by something unsettling. Again, I tried to convince myself I was being overly sensitive. After all, we were here to disconnect and bond with nature. By evening, the conversations turned lower, and the laughter I had enjoyed earlier became uncommon. I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. As I reached for it, expecting to find a signal, the screen remained stubbornly blank. I tried the radios, only to find they were dead as well. A wave of panic washed over me, though I tried to appear all right. The rest of the group seemed unfazed, but I sensed an underlying tension in the air. The beauty of the woods, which had once felt liberating, began to feel awkward. That night, I lay in my tent, staring up at the dark fabric above me, feeling anxious. The rustling leaves made me paranoid, and I started to question every sound, the rustling of animals, the wind weaving through branches, and the crackle of the fire. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the thoughts, until I finally fell asleep. As dawn broke, the sounds of last night felt amplified. Birds chirped, yet their melodies lacked the joyful quality I expected. Breakfast was a tense affair. The banter and light-hearted teasing of the first day were absent, replaced by hurried exchanges and cautious glances. Something seemed terribly wrong. I looked around at other campers. Were we truly here for the same purpose? The day progressed with our activities, increasingly uncomfortable. As we walked deeper into the woods, I tried to push away the anxiety and feeling of engulfment. We reached a clearing with a stream that trickled over smooth stones, but the sound of water felt hollow, without life. I discreetly turned away, my pulse quickening. I needed to find a signal to connect to the outside world. Picking my phone out of my pocket, I prayed for even the faintest glimmer of connectivity. But each attempt proved futile. When we returned to the campsite, I felt a sense of urgency. As I inadvertently wandered away from the fire pit, I searched for anything that might provide clarity. That's when I stumbled upon a hidden area behind some thick underbrush, with old crates and supplies. I rifled through the contents and uncovered an old logbook. The entries detailed the organizers' intentions to study human behavior in isolation, to see how stress could unravel individuals away from the comforts of modern life. I realized I was part of an experiment, designed to strip away our defenses and expose our vulnerabilities. I stumbled back, clutching the logbook tightly. My heart raced as I fumbled with the logbook, the revelation burning in my mind. It was as if the ground beneath me had shifted, and I could no longer tell where I stood in this twisted reality. I turned to flee, my instincts screaming that I needed to get out. My breath quickened as I pushed through the underbrush, my only thought to escape the tightening grip of the forest. When I finally burst into the clearing, the group stood in a circle, their expressions unclear. I held up the logbook, the truth screaming inside, but they only watched. I was surrounded by strangers who had become something unrecognizable in a matter of days. I ran as the landscape morphed into a confusing maze, the world blurring into shadows. I stumbled, trying to regain my bearings, but each step felt like I was sinking deeper. That's when I stopped to document everything. I saved the location of the campsite on my phone and took pictures of the logbook, just in case something happens to me or the files. If someone finds this, it means I didn't make it out alive, but the secrets of this place will not be buried with me.